per weekend drill. Okay? And that's likely to be accepted. General Stoltz in his earlier comments to other groups has made that a big issue for the Army Reserve. I'm 90% certain that will be included. The Montgomery GI Bill of Rights as it affects the Select Reserve. Right now there's no portability of what you have earned. There is a portability provision in there permitting you to use your educational benefits after you've left the Select Reserve. And I'm 90% certain that will stay in the NDA 08. General Stoltz mentioned very quickly the TCS-TDY issue that affects perhaps many of you in the room and affects about 16,000 of your colleagues in the United States Army Reserve. And effectively, now a person would get a BA and a TDY when they came to their duty station. And that's a very expensive, particularly if you're in the DC area. It amounts to $5,000 to $6,000 per month for the per diem payments here. There may or may not have been some abuses. There may not have been some smart taking advantage of the situation, totally legally. But the bottom line is that the Assistant Secretary of the Army for M&RA in late July or early August issued a memorandum basically, as General Stoltz I think phrased it, saying, hey, you have to basically go PCS or get out of the service, and if you stay in, you get 55% of the per diem at the station you've gone to. Well, I'm sure you ROA thinks that's a lousy idea, and I think most of you probably do too. And I think what we're pushing and what a number of other people are pushing now is what we call double BA. Your BA back home, but then getting BA in your TCS site as a single individual. So you get two BAs, home and other location. And a lot of soldiers said that's what they would prefer over the per diem because there's no paperwork involved. It's very predictable. And the money comes out not quite as high maybe, but in some cases, depending on how you spend the BA money, you might make money. Because when you get the TDY money, you've got to have a bill saying, hey, it cost me $4,000 for that apartment. But if you can make up a little bit with the BA, it's yours. So those are my non-CA comments. With regard to CA, first of all, I want to just preface this by saying I served in CA for many years, and I've got just an exceptional admiration for all of you, and it's just growing and growing and growing. I was retired for many years, and then all of a sudden when we got into 2003, I got a call from Office of the SecDef asking if I could return to active duty for 90 days, retiree recall, and I've been gone forever. Make a quick trip to Iraq, Afghanistan, Horn of Africa, make a report and go home. And I was sandwiching, my civilian life was in international development work. I was sandwiching it between projects. I said, hey, that's great, I'll just do that and march on. Well, 2.5 years later, I left active duty. And then I decided, hey, this is a very interesting world I'm living in now. And I decided to move back to Washington, D.C. I've been living in the Midwest and then continue in national security work. But in that time that I was at the Pentagon, I really gained an extraordinary admiration for what's happening now in CA. It's not the old CA I knew. I mean, I did a few things that I was mobilized a couple times. I did a few things I thought were pretty exciting. We had CENTCOM as our AOR, so we didn't just sit around, but you folks are just amazing. Having said that, I also want to say there's a famous judge named Learned Hand, who's long gone now. He lived 100 years ago, and he had a quote that said, you can never win a debate from an opponent who's not handicapped by a knowledge of the facts. Well, I'll be the first to admit I don't know all the facts. I'm going to make some kind of rash statements maybe, but that's life. First of all, somebody commented about the problem that some commanders in the field have. There's too many 05s, 06s in CA. One of my other colleagues here and I were talking tonight, we agree, tough. That's where the functional specialties are. Well, how are you going to grow a captain with a functional specialty when he's 27 years old? I mean, if you really want a high-level, white-collar functional specialist, who's going to go to a 27-year-old neurosurgeon, right? You want to get a guy with hair like mine, you know, who's been around the block a few times. So I say, to heck with those people, you know. And somebody else earlier this morning had the comment, you got to stand up for yourselves. And I couldn't agree more. And I know it's tough for you out there to sometimes stand up for yourselves, but that's when you can come to a group like the CA Association, or ROA, or somebody else, and I think we'd be pretty happy to stand up and say that as loud as we could say it. But the question of functional specialty does lead, frankly, to the elephant in the room that I've heard as I've gone around, and that is, frankly, in CA, do we have at the senior levels real, true functional specialists? Do we bring to the table what a combat commander thinks we bring to the table? At the tactical level, I think everybody says you are superb. At another level, the operational or strategic level, we have to take a long look at ourselves and say, hey, specialties are really specialties. I mean, you got historians who were specialists in the first 17 seconds of the Crimean War, for God's sake. And we almost have to reach that in the 21st century. And how do we get there? And I think General Stoltz was talking about, in the context of agriculture and farmers, and how they wanted to come in uniform. Well, the question is, do we grow a specialist in the military as we grow from lieutenant to colonel? Or do we go the other direction, and do we go and get a functional specialist who has made it through 25 years of outside work and study and schooling, and bring him into the military? And I think he was kind of a little bit suggesting that might have some merit. Of course, the World War II model is more or less that. We've brought in state senators, mayors, political scientists, and other specialists to do military governance in Germany particularly, and in Japan. Well, why not think about that across a wide spectrum of things for the military? If people are, I think there's a regulation that says the president of the SecDef can bring people in up to 2 stars. Well, you're going to get some darn good specialists if they can come in with 2 stars. And if people in the room have a problem with 2 stars, as somebody else in the room said, put a big S on their insignia saying he's a specialist. He's not a commander 2 stars, he's a specialist 2 stars. You don't want to bring the guy in as a warrant, no offense to warrants, but make him a specialist 2 stars. If he is really and truly, the greatest investment banker in the world. How many investment bankers has the active Army grown? How many investment bankers at the top level are in RC now, in CA? Not very many. Mike Hess might be the closest, and he's at USA. So, I mean, we have to be a little bit realistic. When we talk about specialists, there's tons of them in America. And if we were to figure out a way to bring them into the USAR, particularly, wouldn't that bring our nation more into the war and affiliate a lot of great people who are policymakers, decision makers, opinion makers into the game with you? I think it would. Somewhere in the room, I'm not sure where I see her right now, but is Paula Feeney. Maybe some of you have talked to her over the course of the day. Oh, Paula's down here. She's with a group called the Emerging Markets Group. They've been a sponsor of some of our CA programs. They're a huge development company. Companies like Bearing Point, Checky, others. But EMG, if you want to chat with her about the data banks they've developed on specialists, they've got thousands and thousands of specialists in their data banks for everything from governance to economics to health, you name it, because they're contracting across the board. I know that they were engaged in one of the first contracts with when Iraq came down in summer 2003. And Paul, I may be off by a few numbers. You can correct me if you want to, but more or less there were 2 big companies that got down to the final bids on the economic development portion of that project, a USA $100 million contract. Okay, so I mean, like when you were out there in 2003, getting ready to go in June, July, they had a team of 25 people preparing a 200-page response to a request for proposal for USAID on a $100 million contract on standing up the economy of Iraq. And real roughly, between themselves and Bearing Point, they cornered the market with about 100 subcontractors for them and 100 subcontractors for Bearing Point, and then they went toe-to-toe, and one of the 2 got the contract. But they're both outstanding companies. I might add, Bearing Point now has the contract with SCRS to develop the training program for what we've heard described earlier by one of the speakers yesterday as the Civilian Response Corps. John tells me I've got about a minute, and I'll finish up in that time. Let me just say that the Civilian Response Corps, as that speaker said, is the generic term for 3 things. The Active Response Corps, where they've got about 100 folks. The Standby Response Corps, where they're hoping to get a couple hundred folks. And then the Civilian Reserve Corps, which is kind of going to be maybe you folks, where they're hoping to get up to 4,000.